Welcome all. Thank you so much for joining us for this event on rethinking intellectual property for pandemic preparedness and response, organized with Jonathan Wolf at Oxford's Blavatnik School of Government, the Global Health Impact Project, and the Independent Research Group for Global Health Justice. The World Trade Organization's recent negotiations regarding the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights waiver, or TRIPS waiver, which concerned how developing countries might use intellectual property related to life-saving COVID-19 countermeasures, were disastrous from a global health perspective. The resulting TRIPS decision to specify that developing countries seeking to export unlimited quantities of COVID-19 vaccines to developing country importers could do so pursuant to a temporary 5-year waiver, conditioned on adequate compensation to patent holders. Although the decision does not include diagnostics and therapeutics, further negotiations on whether to include tests and treatments were to be undertaken within 6 months. However, by reinforcing an already ineffective precedent of unequal access and restricted use of intellectual property rights provisions, the new agreement did not set a viable precedent for future pandemic preparedness, and changes must be made. The upcoming pandemic treaty negotiations must include improvements to help increase access to essential health services for all. Global Health Impact's Pandemic Health Equity Working Group has been developing a proposal for transparent and streamlined funding for new technologies on the condition that licenses for these technologies be vested in a well-governed international organization, and that companies pool intellectual property, knowledge, and data necessary to produce and distribute them around the world. We propose providing collective procurement organizations with first purchase options on these technologies if they employ differential pricing to help the international community recoup investments in research and development and invest in basic health systems, improvements to regulatory procedures, and manufacturing to ensure people can access these innovations. We also propose linking incentives for new innovation to access in a way that will address the need for greater manufacturing, health infrastructure, workers, education, transportation, electricity supply, and the other things that people need to actually secure essential health technologies in pandemic times. We argue that economies of scale and global coordination and cooperation can make this proposal cost-effective. But what other options might ensure access to essential countermeasures? Does ensuring equitable access to essential health technologies in pandemic times require rethinking intellectual property rights in new ways? After all, industry's focus on commercial returns has historically sidelined research on emergent disease risks in favor of blockbuster products that meet the needs of patients in rich and upper middle income countries. Even the promise of intellectual property exclusivities has historically been insufficient to incentivize private sector research and development on neglected and emerging diseases, which means most of the basic and translational science has been funded by governments. And paradoxically, even though public sector investment has dominated, especially with COVID-19 and things like Operation Warp Speed, publicly funded researchers have been free to privatize the fruits of public investment, and government researchers have transferred their innovations to private entities with few strings attached. How can we better prepare for and respond to pandemic threats and ensure medicines essential for health and life do not cost too much for poor people to purchase because they're under patent protection? Today, our illustrious panel will discuss previous successes, current efforts, and new ideas that may be transformative. There are a lot of exciting proposals on the table, and I'm delighted to discuss some of these with our panelists today. So with that, I'll hand over the baton to Brooke Baker, who will introduce our speakers and help moderate the discussion. Professor Baker teaches law at Northeastern University. He's an honorary fellow at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban, South Africa, and a senior policy analyst for HealthGap, Global Access Project. He's worked on universal access to treatment, prevention, and care for people with AIDS, and more recently on accelerating research on and equitable access to vaccines, medicines, and diagnostics to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. He's written and consulted extensively on intellectual property rights, trade, investor-state dispute settlement, access to medicines, and medicine regulatory policy. And Professor Baker has served as a board member at the NGO delegation to UNITAID and is presently a civil society representative to the therapeutics pillar of the Access to COVID-19 Accelerator. So with that, thank you again, Brooke, for leading the discussion.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all our attendees for this, what I hope will be a very illuminating discussion. In a sense, a brief overview of multiple topics, each of which could take the full hour-and-a-half seminar. So unfortunately, we'll be giving you mostly highlights. Just to remind you, you should feel free to put questions, and panelists may try to give you answers in the Q&A. Use the Q&A button. The chat button doesn't really work. It doesn't. I don't think it operates for everyone. So that's where you should put your questions and comments. And then we will hopefully have lots of time at the end to also take questions from participants. So we have a very distinguished panel. I may be aging myself, but I tried to add up the number of years that I've known the people on this panel, and it's close to 70 between our four panelists. And all of them have done splendid work, literally for decades, with people needing access to medicines and other health technologies that they do not have access to because of governing intellectual property regimes and the commercialization of what might otherwise and should be global public goods. So I'm going to introduce people very briefly because you can read about their extensive biographies on the webpage for the webinar, and just to leave extra time for them. So we're going to start with Sangeeta Shashikant from Third World Network. She is going to discuss the WTO TRIPS decision this past June, the very disappointing outcome despite a fairly bold proposal by South Africa and India, and also the current efforts to expand that very limited agreement that applied only to COVID-19 vaccines to now include therapeutics and diagnostics. Ellen Toten from Medicine Law and Policy, a former executive director of the Medicine Patent Pool, a former head of MSF Access to Medicine campaign, will have three major topics to discuss in a very short period of time. One is the establishment of the COVID Technology Access Pool by WHO early in 2020 as an effort to get voluntary licenses in for emerging technologies, both to incentivize innovation, but also to try to create, allow generic entry and competitive supply and pricing to keep prices low and to expand supply. She'll also describe the medicine patent pool and its recent licenses, particularly on outpatient antivirals, with a new one just having been reached 2 days ago. And then she's going to also turn briefly to the state of affairs for trying to negotiate progressive intellectual property provisions to override barriers to IP in the pandemic preparedness and response to negotiations that are ongoing right now. Third, we'll have Esteban Barón, policy advisor at Medicine Patent Pool, who's going to talk about a very innovative initiative in South Africa and other countries to establish something called Messenger RNA Vaccine Technology Transfer Hub, where the hub is going to establish basically a clone of the Moderna vaccine and perhaps with improvements in terms of heat stability, but also thereafter to try to seek messenger RNA therapies and vaccines for many other pressing health needs. Those technologies and the know-how to produce them will be shared with multiple spokes in other southern countries, but subject to an agreement that those companies will also share back their innovations to the hub and with other spokes. So a very exciting model that Esteban will be discussing. Then lastly, we'll have Fatima Hassan from the Health and Justice Initiative in South Africa, who will talk about somewhat in reaction to these proposals that are on the table, but also talk about the country-based campaigns that have to take place both in the global south and in the global north to try to move the needle on overcoming intellectual property barriers currently for COVID-19, but certainly for future pandemics and for other global health needs as well. So with that, I will turn the table over to Sangeeta. And Sangeeta, please tell us about that terrible TRIPS decision.
So let me begin by thanking the organizers and Brooke in particular for inviting me to this panel. So I'm going to speak about the 17 June WTO TRIPS decision. But for us to better understand the decision, I think it is important to know where we came from, right? So it started off in 2020. There was a global pandemic. We saw that there were a lot of different promises of solidarity, universal access. ACTA was established, multi-stakeholder was established in the WHO. And I think for many of us working in the access to medicines field for a very long time, we thought it would be very, very different this time. I think very soon we realized, and I think we have learned a big lesson, is that these promises really mean nothing. We saw really massive inequity at a time where we should have seen solidarity and international cooperation. This did not happen. Each country was for itself, and I think it is notable that UNCTAD in October 2020, at the peak of the pandemic, was actually found that for each resident in high-income country, they benefited from $10 of COVID medical products, and in developing country, it was $1. In the least developed country, it was 10 cents. So the more vulnerable you are, the less access you have actually to what is needed. And if we are talking about equitable access, we really are talking about availability and affordability. And during a global pandemic, we do need to scale up global manufacturing and to diversify the suppliers globally, especially in developing countries, because what is very clear was the entire production was highly concentrated in a few manufacturers and in a few countries. So a key issue that needs to be addressed when we're talking about diversifying production, scaling up manufacturing is intellectual property. Across the different technologies, be it test kits, masks, medicines, vaccines, ventilators, AI, any of this, there are multiple different intellectual property that actually come into play. And we already saw from end of 2020, 2021, and even today, there have been several patent disputes. The most recent being Moderna actually taking action against Pfizer, saying that you are using my patents and you will need to pay me royalty. And we also saw disputes in the case of diagnostics, ventilators as well. So at the end of the day, this is a key core issue that needs to be addressed. And we are talking about vaccines. The issue is also patents and trade secret protection, the sharing of know-how. So in 2020, India and South Africa, October 2020, India and South Africa presented a comprehensive proposal. The idea was to waive specific provisions of the TRIPS agreement across not just patents, we typically speak about patents, but copyright, industrial design, trade secret. And the focus was COVID-19. And this was in October 2020, where it became very clear that unless we move at a global level, it's very difficult to see how we can actually address this inequity. And so there was a call for a waiver of 35 articles of the TRIPS agreement. The rationale being we are in a global health emergency. There is a massive global supply gap. There's a need to scale up production. At that point, actually, the pharmaceutical industry had already objected to participating in CTAP, and they continued to object to participate in CTAP, and I think even today. And if there is an IP barrier, although you might have some flexibilities in your national law, such as compulsory license, it has to be done country by country, and all of this involves procedural and administrative delays. So if you want to address a challenge at the international level, there should be full freedom to operate for potential manufacturers, and allowing that freedom to operate allows for collaboration between manufacturers, but also between countries, also within the region, and to have that economies of scale and that sharing of technology and know-how that could have supported manufacturing. The scope of that original proposal was to cover all health products needed for COVID-19. And there was a very strong legal basis for it. The WTO agreement, Article 9 of it, is very clear that in exceptional circumstances, you can waive provisions of any agreement of WTO for a specified duration. And WTO, it is quite a common thing to actually have waiver decisions in the WTO, and there have been waiver decisions even in the context of the TRIPS agreement. So it was nothing unique in that sense. It received huge global support. It's co-sponsored by 65 developing countries. But it faced strong opposition from the US, EU, UK, and Switzerland. Now, US said that they are open to the idea of an IP waiver for vaccines in May 2021, but we really didn't see much movement from the United States. And, it seems in the discussions, they were also opposed to a full-on waiver of the TRIPS agreement, even if it was limited to vaccines. And we saw that in 2020 and 2021, it was really just opposition to any kind of discussion. The narrative was IP is not an issue. If there is an issue, there was CTAP, but we know CTAP, nobody wanted to give licenses. Then they said there were VLs, and then they said there was COVAX, but COVAX had no supply. So the argument kept shifting, and there was a refusal to engage with the proposed text. Now, the 12th Ministerial Conference was supposed to happen in 2021, but it was postponed because of the Omicron. But by the end of 2021, it became very clear that unless, at least to many countries in the WTO, to the WTO DG, that unless there is something on the TRIPS waiver, there is movement on the TRIPS waiver, there'll be no progress for the next 12th Ministerial Conference. It was already postponed, but there was going to be no Ministerial Conference so to speak. And then also there'll be no decision on the WTO pandemic response document that was actually proposed by the EU and other developed countries. And so early 2022, the WTO DG held high-level ministerial consultations between the US, EU, South Africa, and India. Now, these were very confidential consultations. We don't really know what happened, but different news reports out there say this was, what was really presented was a take it or leave it draft text that actually reflected the lowest common denominator. And this text actually contains several TRIPS plus elements. That means to say these are elements that are not required by the WTO TRIPS agreement that actually would hinder access. They were actually reflected in this text. Now, this text was first leaked. There was a lot of discussion on this leaked text. Eventually, it came out as a DG's text. It was not endorsed by the four. We know that EU was very much in favor of that text. It was never really agreed at that level. But then the DG decided to take it and put it forward as a DG's text. And this became the basis for text-based negotiations in May, heading towards the 12th Ministerial Conference in June 2022. So in summary, what are the key elements of the decision? The first element to note is that it is built on Article 31 of TRIPS, on compulsory license, which is in Article 31 of TRIPS. This is the right of the government issues a license to a third party to use the patented invention for the duration of the compulsory license without the consent of the patent holder. So this is already a flexibility which is in the WTO TRIPS agreement. And this decision that came out in June builds on that article. So it doesn't give anything new in that sense. The use of compulsory license in Article 31 is about patents, and it's always subject to certain conditions. One condition when a country uses compulsory license is Article 31F. Article 31F says that the compulsory license should be predominantly for the supply of the domestic market, which means you can export, but it has to be mainly for the domestic market. Now, this can create a problem if you want to, for countries with insufficient manufacturing capacity. And so there has been a decision before in the form of Article 31 bis that waives that condition. But that decision has been very difficult to use because it comes with many, many procedures. So this decision again builds on that waiver of Article 31F, but it has got less conditions attached to its use. The reason it is limited to this is because it's something that is the only thing, if you like, the EU could really live with. The scope is limited to vaccines. It says that no later than 6 months, therapeutics and diagnostics will be addressed. We are already for almost 4 months past the 6 months. There's been no movement on it. Even during the negotiations, countries like UK were very much opposed to having any mention of diagnostics and therapeutics. Actually, they did not even want any mention that within 6 months we will actually address that issue. The US wanted a two-track process. That is why they say vaccines we will deal with now and therapeutics and diagnostics later. But we are at a stage where they're all now saying, what is the issue with therapeutics and diagnostics and intellectual property? So you can see that the delaying tactics are again being played all over again in the TRIPS Council. So essentially the decision is compulsory license of patents for the production and supply of vaccines. It waives this one article, Article 31F. And so with this waiver, you can export all or most of your production. The duration of the waiver, not the duration of the compulsory license, but the duration of the waiver is 5 years. And normally when you do a waiver in the WTO, it is temporary and limited. And you'll see one paragraph is on Article 39.3. This is typically a very controversial, contentious paragraph, because there's a different interpretation between developed countries and developing countries. But I think we'll look at the clarification. It does support the interpretation of developing countries. And Article 39.3 is about protection of undisclosed information in connection with pharmaceutical product test data that has been submitted with respect to pharmaceutical products. I'm not going to go into too much detail into it, but just to mention that I think the reading of it is more of a clarification that supports the interpretation of developing countries. Paragraph 2 is useful for implementation. It allows to implement it through an executive decree. Paragraph 9 says basically that it is without prejudice to other rights and flexibilities that countries have. Now, this decision does come with some conditions. One condition is that it is limited.
Sangeeta, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up. Sorry.
Yeah. So there are some conditions. I think some of these conditions are actually against access to medicines. It's only limited to eligible members. It's overly broad and problematic. The exclusion in footnote 1. There's an anti-diversion measure, and then there's an obligation to notify. Again, these are all burdensome for developing country. So the end of it is that some may benefit from this decision, perhaps, those facing existing and potential patent barriers, producing vaccine where you intend to export most of it. And where we got here was really opposition from the developed countries, and you see different developed countries have made different demands, and this is where we are. It is not the comprehensive waiver that is proposed by the co-sponsors. It's clearly not sufficient to address health emergencies, but it does improve on the text that the DG had issued. And I think that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Sangeeta. And now we will go to Ellen, who will talk about 3 topics in amazing fashion, I'm sure.
Thank you, Brooke. And I would like to start also with thanking the organizers for inviting me to take part in this session. I'll start with a few lessons learned over the last 2 years and some recommendations for the future. Now, I think the most important lesson that we've learned over the last 2 years is that it is extremely difficult to sort out equitable access to pandemic countermeasures in the middle of a health emergency, certainly when it concerns IP issues. That doesn't mean that people have not tried, as Sangeeta already mentioned, and so did Brooke. In May 2020, the World Health Organization established the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool. It did this well before the vaccines and therapeutics became available, but expecting that they would become available, they thought, and this was initially a proposal by Costa Rica, that it would be very important to have a mechanism in place that would facilitate the sharing of the know-how, the intellectual property, the manufacturing knowledge, whatever it requires to produce these countermeasures. Now, there hasn't been much uptake for that, certainly not by vaccine producers. Now, the development of COVID vaccines were largely de-risked, as we know, by governments. Massive amounts of government financing has gone into the development of these vaccines. This was a very good thing. I think that's exactly what needs to happen when you're dealing with the crisis, as we still are at the moment. But this would have been, of course, the moment for governments to say, now here's the money, but in exchange for that financing, you have to commit to sharing the knowledge and the know-how and the IPs you generate with this money. That did not happen. The money went out of the door. The rich countries were scrambling to get in front of the line to benefit from the results of that. By the way, it's World Animal Day today. So what you hear in the back is my little spoiled dog who wants more treats. You're just going to have to live with that. It's the 4th of October. So in response to the rejection of CTAP and other IP sharing mechanisms, as Sangeeta already discussed, South Africa and India proposed at the TRIPS Council a TRIPS waiver, a comprehensive waiver of IP obligations. And what we see today is that the TRIPS Council is still haggling over whether the decision, this waiver became a decision with a tiny little waiver in the middle, whether this decision will be extended to therapeutics and diagnostics, as if that is actually still a question. So again, very little progress there. So as of this morning, and here is perhaps a little bit of brighter news, the Medicines Patent Pool holds licenses for 3 therapeutics. The one that they announced this morning concerns a pipeline product. So that product does not have regulatory approval yet, but that is a good thing in the sense that you then know that once that product does get regulatory approval, generic manufacturers can enter the game very, very quickly. But we also know that these licenses do come with restrictions, and there are also products that are recommended and necessary for the treatment, particularly of vulnerable people with COVID, such as the monoclonal antibodies, are not part of these technology transfer efforts. So again, gaps there. The mRNA hubs, we'll hear more details from Esteban about that. They're making great progress. This is an exciting development, but it remains a scandal that the right holders are not collaborating with this initiative. So I would like to spend the remaining minutes I have on talking about what needs to happen to remedy the situation for the future. And I'm going to share my screen with you and show you one slide. Can you confirm that this is working? So for the next time around, and this of course speaks to the discussions that are today taking place in Geneva, the preparations for the pandemic treaty that are being discussed, that is being negotiated at the World Health Organization, and equity and access to knowledge and IP is a central theme in that. We hosted an expert working group on this topic last year in October. We published our recommendations not so long ago in the British Medical Journal Global Health, and this is a summary of it. So this is what we think needs to happen, needs to be addressed in the new instrument that is being negotiated. Well, first of all, finance biomedical research and development. This de-risking of the development of pandemic countermeasures is very important. But second, it should not happen without strings attached. This government-funded innovations should be licensed, should be available. The know-how and the IP should be available for others to use. So no government funding without agreeing to that condition. Mandate technology transfer. It is not just patents we're talking about. You need, particularly when you deal with vaccines or more complex technologies such as biologics, you need to direct technology transfer. Technology sharing should be a norm in the pandemic preparedness and response, and it should not just be left to the willingness of the companies, which we have seen over the last 2 years is very limited to engage in technology transfer. Require intellectual property and knowledge sharing. Voluntary IP sharing mechanisms are insufficient in pandemics. A treaty should require that a declaration of public health emergency of international concern trigger compulsory sharing of IP and knowledge. We need, fifth, streamlining of regulatory standards and procedures to make sure that products that are developed can rapidly become available and do not and that their availability is not hampered by regulatory barriers. We need greater transparency. International coordination is often stifled by a lack of information sharing at all levels, and the treaty should address that. And last but not least, the treaty needs to, of course, assure inclusive governance and resources for also smaller and poorer nations to fully engage in this in these endeavors. Now we realize that these are tall orders, but we also have to realize that and I think everyone does, that pandemics are serious events. It's extraordinary, and they require extraordinary responses that cannot be based on the piecemeal reactions that we've seen over the last 2 years. Promises have been made by political leaders of, for example, vaccines being global goods. We've heard the president of France, the president of the European Union making big promises, but they have not followed through with action. It sounded at the beginning of the pandemic that these measures would be based much more on solidarity, as Sangeeta also referred to. But what we've seen over the last months is that solidarity principle very quickly went out of the window and was replaced by an insufficient charity model. And people in developing countries are still suffering from that. So with that, I hope I've given enough food for thought and food for discussion, and I'll hand over back to Brooke. Thank you.
Ellen, can I ask you to very briefly talk about the treaty negotiations that are underway and the kind of concrete kinds of efforts that civil society and academics might make to contribute to addressing the IP problems?
So countries, so these are the member states of the World Health Organization. So this is not taking place at the World Trade Organization. The pandemic treaty negotiations are taking place at the World Health Organization. It will be a binding treaty that may mean that some bits are less binding than others, but it will be a binding treaty. The WHO is consulting with various groups and with various stakeholders. This week, again, there are 2 sort of deep dives where people, and a number of people that are also part of this meeting. I will speak on IP on Friday, for example. So it's worth following these discussions, and there is also opportunity to engage with the process as civil society, to engage with the process directly by commenting on drafts. But what I think will be very important, that was actually my last point on my written notes group, not on my slides, so I missed it, but we will need a really proactive movement to get some of these more radical ideas, because some people will consider what I just outlined, will consider radical, but there seems to be an openness to address these IP issues in a serious manner. And when that happens, that will then, of course, also have a rollover effect into other organizations, possibly even into the WTO. But it will not happen by just these empty promises. We've had enough of those. We need to get very concrete and work with delegations directly to make sure that these ideas that people in general like. We've had very positive responses to our BMJ article, for example, but that is not the same as translating them into actual treaty text and subsequent action. So that is something that we will need to get organized for. Oh.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we'll hear from Esteban about the tremendous initiative in South Africa, the Technology Transfer Hub and Spokes.
Hi, Brooke, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to say a few words around this initiative. And I guess what I'd like to briefly walk you through is just basic introduction to the mRNA Tech Transfer Hub program, for those of you who are not familiar with it. Then I'll speak to issues around freedom to operate for that program. And thirdly, wanted to talk about how this program is intending to address kind of an innovation model more generally and the sharing of knowledge that will be generated through this program. So let me start first with what is the mRNA Tech Transfer Hub program. It's a program that MPP is so the Medicines Patent Pool is co-leading together with the WHO. And what it aims to do is to develop manufacturing capacity for mRNA vaccines in low and middle income countries. As you probably aware, this is technology that's new. First vaccines relying on mRNA technology were developed in the context of COVID-19. So there are currently no other manufacturers other than those that have been somehow involved in developing and manufacturing the vaccines that have approval in the context of COVID. What is going to be interesting here is that the idea is we're working initially with Afrigen, which is a company in South Africa, to develop an mRNA vaccine that is going to be as close as possible to approved vaccines, really to prove the concept, to prove that technology can be developed, and therefore that same technology platform subsequently could be applied to a number of other disease areas, because that's one of the beauties of mRNA vaccine is that once you have a technology platform that's viable, you could choose to replace the part that attaches to SARS-CoV-2 and include an antigen for a different disease. Now, so once that technology and while it is being developed in Afrigen, it will be transferred to manufacturers in other 15 countries, which have already been selected through a process that WHO led, and based on countries and manufacturers applying to be part of this program. And what that tech transfer will include is not just the materials needed to make that mRNA vaccine. So the drug substance, the cell bank, the encapsulated mRNA, but also all the analytical documentation and the manufacturing instructions. So really a full-fledged transfer over a period of time, and this will be done in various installments as the technology gets developed. And this is a program that is still in early phases. The phase 1 will be started hopefully early next year. Now, in relation to one of the questions that Brooke had asked while preparing this event was how you're dealing with the freedom to operate concerns, so intellectual property that may be out there already. And I think in relation to that, there's essentially 3 sets of patents that we need to be looking at. There's firstly, the early stage technology, mRNA vaccine technology patents, which had been applied several years back, by organizations like University of Pennsylvania, NIH, and a number of companies as well. And what's interesting in relation to that is that by and large, these patents have not been filed in low and middle income countries, and therefore doesn't seem to be many challenges in terms of freedom to operate. The second set of patents that we need to be looking at are those that have been integrated into the COVID mRNA vaccines that were filed by companies like Moderna, BioNTech, and CureVac. Some of these were filed prior to COVID and have been granted in a few LMIC jurisdictions. And in some cases, the granted claims have been narrowed quite a bit. So, during the prosecution of those patents, but some have fairly wide claims in some countries. And, South Africa being a clear example where patents are granted without substantive examination, and in some cases there are fairly broad claims. So in some cases, it's likely that it will be possible to invent around some of these patents or rely on some of the commitments that companies have made not to enforce those patents for COVID vaccines. But some challenges may still remain even with that. And finally, there are all those patents that are surfacing now, which are either specific to COVID-19 and therefore filed, since COVID appeared, but also relevant to second generation mRNA vaccine and or relevant to other diseases which RNA vaccines could be. And in relation to these, in some respects, these are the most challenging ones because they're still in the international phase. We still don't know where they're going to go national, where they're going to be filed. And we also don't know what the granted claims are going to look like. So how easy or difficult it will be to navigate the patent, the patents that will be emerging. And some of these may still not even be public because they, as you know, from the moment a patent gets filed, usually they get published 18 months later. So as always, when you're working on cutting edge technology, in particular, a technology that has proven to be immensely important and, may I say, also profitable, there are a large number of patent applications emerging, and securing FTO, or freedom to operate strategies, you need to be looking at a combination of different strategies. And this will be the responsibility of the companies that we're working with, and MPPs providing support in really trying to identify which are the relevant patents and ways in which potentially they can be invented around. And where possible, also negotiating licenses that would enable to secure the freedom to operate that may be needed in relation to this work. Finally, about the innovation model that is being developed by this program. So the way it's structured is that the technology is being developed as Afrigen, as I said, and they will be shared with 15, 20 spokes in different countries. At the moment, there's 15 that are already identified. It's not just sharing of know-how, as I said, there are also biological materials, including the master cell bank and the working cell bank, and all the instructions, and there'll be training also going on at Afrigen. So secondly, all the companies that are participating in the program, all those that will be receiving the technology package and the technical support, need to commit that in turn they will share back with the others via MPP on a royalty-free worldwide basis any inventions and discoveries that they develop in the context of the program. So really the idea is companies benefiting from the innovation that comes out of this program, if they innovate further and take that one step further, or adapt the technology to a different disease, or use it in other ways, that then gets shared back. And the idea really is to develop a network of companies that are working on developing mRNA vaccine technology and sharing among them the innovations they themselves come up with. And over time, we'd like to see this as not just a manufacturing network, but really an R&D network developing. So I'm going to pause here because I know that I'm probably we're tight with time, but I'm happy, of course, to respond to any questions there may be around this program and more generally around the Medicines Patent Pool and the licenses it negotiates. Thank you, Brooke.
Esteban, before we move on, maybe you could answer one other question. There's both freedom to operate in terms of countries being free to manufacture and potentially to export, but there's also freedom to operate in the sense of countries being able to buy and import and use. So because these are regional suppliers hopefully they are not just going to be for domestic manufacture, they also hope to supply other countries. And so is the hub also analyzing and working on the larger problem of aggregating a sufficient market on a regional basis or otherwise for the product, and how those barriers might be overcome?
Thank you, Brooke. And certainly, the issue of the market for the end product, once and if we get there, is going to be critical, and the whole sustainability of the model and of the vaccine manufacturers beyond COVID-19, because unless I think it's particularly key to ensure that there are other vaccines that can be for which the technology can be applied, and so far that's not proven to be the case. So the sustainability of the model on the market side of it is one where WHO is leading on, and I think it's going to be a critical component when you need very strong government and regional commitments to making this work, because there is a clear challenge. And I think part of that also means looking at the freedom to operate that would exist beyond just the country where the technology is being developed, but also other countries in those regions that potentially could benefit from accessing the product. So yeah, definitely that's of course part of the broader discussion here. Thank you.
Okay, so perhaps we can now go to Fatima to tell us about the country campaigns that have started and that need to be undertaken. Thank you so much.
Thanks. And thanks to the organizers for the meeting. And Brooke, I think the issue is that there's a context here as to why South Africa's maybe unwittingly or maybe in a way that was unplanned at the heart of many of the issues that we're discussing here today, and a crisis that I think is going to hit us in the next few months. And when I talk about being at the heart of this, it's because South Africa led on the waiver proposal. Ironically, South Africa also agreed and was part of the process to agree to what we call a really weak or a bad deal, a deal that is a slap in the face for poor people all around the world because of the many restrictions that Sangeeta has already quite eloquently explained. We also have the first mRNA hub that is in South Africa. So even if it's not necessarily led or co-led by the South African government, but has its participation with different research bodies as well, it is governed by the laws of South Africa. And those laws are a problem because our patent laws haven't been fixed. It's a relic of a TRIPS plus kind of version of IP laws, and also a relic of our apartheid era regime. So those laws haven't been amended. There's been a bill that's been sitting basically on the minister's desk for the past 4 years due to a lot of vested interest, and I think also pharmaceutical pressure, as well as the same countries that exerted pressure in the WTO deal, WTO waiver process. Those countries are also trying to extract certain concessions. So that bill, in my view, has not been tabled because of a lot of political pressures as well. There's been some undertaking by the minister when we were sort of discussing with government the reasons why they agreed to this really bad deal. There was an undertaking that he would table the bill by October, but I do believe that that's going to be at least a 5 or 10-year battle to actually get that law passed by our parliament. At the same time, our government, while it was pushing and advocating for the waiver, agreeing to the hub being set up in South Africa, it granted really broad and very worrying patents to Moderna, and Esteban has explained. Some of those patents were withdrawn in other countries or were not granted in other countries. But in South Africa, we gave them these patents. Moderna has not filed a regulatory dossier with our medicines regulator in South Africa. So that's just another thing to note. But it has started trials here in South Africa in 2022. So that's sort of the context of why South Africa is in the middle of this, basically the situation. And what I want to do, what I want to respond to in terms of what both Alan and Esteban have also been saying is that IP is so integral to this entire ecosystem. And it's not just going to be a matter of trying to deal with patent laws for us to be able to, get out of this pandemic, but also manage future pandemics, because IP and the lack of transparency, despite some efforts to try and have more information sharing, but really there's been a lack of transparency in this pandemic, is infiltrating into how we're doing R&D, how we're doing decisions around clinical trials, decisions around access, around pricing, around licensing. And so it's forcing us into the situation where instead of governments being able to be in a position of power to take action, to be able to protect people in their country, we're having to rely on voluntary action and voluntary measures as well as voluntary licensing, which is why the deal, the TRIPS deal, as well as the continued ability of the hub to operate is so integral, and I think it's going to come to a head. So the one thing I wanted to mention about the bad deal or the TRIPS waiver deal, which Sangeeta alluded to, but I just wanted to emphasize in relation to the hub, is that because it only deals with the issue of patents, it doesn't deal with trade secrets and know-how. And so many of us are concerned in South Africa that unless the South African government has a way in which they're going to figure out how to deal with this, it may potentially hobble the work of the hub. And this is something that we've alerted both the WHO as well as the MPP to. So now I want to turn to the hub. The hub for us, basically, there's a few options that are currently on the table. And I think this is important because on the one hand, it's supposed to be this really brilliant, amazing technology transfer, within countries in the global south, and the 17 spoke countries are really dependent on what is able to happen here in Cape Town. The hub is actually down the road from us. Some of us were fortunate to be able to visit the facilities a few weeks ago. The hub, we believe, its freedom to operate is potentially at risk because of a few things. The first is that unless the South African government that agreed to the really bad WTO deal is willing to take executive action to protect the hub, then we do believe that you actually need a really robust plan B. And that's an IP plan B in order to protect the future work of a hub. And the future work of a hub is what we're really concerned about. And this is why we've been saying that the domestic campaign to fix South Africa's patent laws and to fix South Africa's IP laws is so critical. Because when Sangeeta mentioned that Pfizer is being sued by Moderna, the one thing that we were able to glean from that affidavit is that there is now this written pledge or written commitment to protecting the hub from any kind of legal threat from Moderna in relation to COVID-19 only, and only for COVID-19 vaccine. The parts that we are concerned about is whether the South African government is going to take executive action to protect the work of the hub in relation to its work on TB and HIV and potentially any other disease where you can use this mRNA platform. And already there's human trials that may be starting next year on COVID, and there's some preliminary trials that are happening on TB. Whether Moderna will actually come to the table, and again, where we have to basically go to it with a begging bowl and ask for it to play nice, or ask for its voluntary cooperation, and that's something that Alan alluded to already, which is just not sustainable, and it doesn't put power in our hands. And whether our government is actually going to be able to have the strength and the resilience to take on the industry once again, to table the law in our parliament and to expeditiously pass it. Now, the concern is that while South Africa was pushing for the waiver, it wasted also 2 years in not tabling the bill in the South African parliament. And that's really, during a pandemic, it's time when you could actually have passed the law, and that delay is really inexplicable. So what should South Africa do now? What do we need to do now in order to not just protect the hub and the work of the researchers at the hub in the different spoke countries, not just to lend the necessary support to the WHO and the MPP to make sure that the future functioning of the hub is not at risk beyond COVID, and also to make sure that we are able to hold the South African government to account and to make sure that it does the necessary, or it takes the necessary steps in order to not just protect the work of a hub, but even if we go beyond that, to ensure that we have a long-term strategy to make sure that there's equitable access to medicines. I mean, the first thing, and this is what we've included in the explainer on the WTO deal, is that, of course, the first call of the global movement of medicine access activists has to be that Moderna should drop the patent in South Africa. I think that has to be an unambiguous call. And if it refuses to, and if it doesn't want to, then certainly our government has the law on its side, and it has civil society on its side to be able to issue public non-commercial licenses or use orders. Secondly, we need to pass the laws for all the reasons I've explained earlier. But mainly there are 4 things that we really need to address, and that is part of the campaign of multiple groups, including the Fix the Patent Laws campaign in South Africa, and that is to ensure that South Africa is able to at least include pre- and post-grant opposition procedures. And Esteban mentioned that the reason why such broad patents were granted in South Africa in favor of Moderna is because we actually don't even have a PGO system. Secondly, stricter patentability criteria. This builds also on the work that IMEC has done, which has just showed a global system of over-patenting, not just evergreening, but also over-patenting. And then, certain recommendations around including public interest as well as competition law to this entire ecosystem of how we manage this. And thirdly, I mean, South Africa, in addition to protecting the hub, taking executive action, passing the necessary domestic laws, could also take the necessary action to deal with issues around treatment and diagnostics, and not necessarily wait for the WTO in relation to the 6-month provisions, etc. So I am now struggling to stop. Oh, there we go. Stop sharing the screen. And just basically want to end off by saying that, I mean, if you look at the political economy of where we're at, and given what I said at the beginning of how we are somehow in the middle of this crisis, unfortunately, I think the political outlook is that our president is not necessarily going to take the necessary executive action, which once again means that in the absence of our lawmakers passing the law, in the absence of the WTO extending the agreement to therapeutics, to diagnostics, in the absence of Moderna coming to the table and dropping their patterns of voluntarily cooperating with the WHO and the NDP, it's going to be left to civil society to be able to take the necessary legal measures to not just protect the work of the hub in relation to COVID-19, but also to protect its future work. So let me end. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the tremendous presentations by all of the panelists thus far. It's really been amazing to have accomplished so much in such a short time. We're going to gather questions from and have comments, though I'm not quite sure if we're going to be able to have participants raise hands. Maybe someone can let me know that in a moment. But I have some questions to out of the presentations to just have us think about a little bit more, and maybe have the panelists respond to. So Sangeeta, I think, and Fatima both mentioned the trade secret problem, which really came to the fore with vaccines. We understood in a new way that the issues were not just patents. They were the commercial know-how and information needed to bring a clone to the market. And I would like to, if any of the panelists have anything to say about particular strategies to address that unmet need. There's certainly an argument that TRIPS agreement would allow. It certainly doesn't disallow efforts in this regard. It doesn't provide the kind of direct mechanism that Article 31 or 31 bis provides. But there's, by the same token, Article 39 might allow approaches on accessing trade secret information. We haven't heard much about compulsory licenses, and I wonder if someone would like to talk about the efforts to issue compulsory licenses, both for countries in Latin America, and also something which Jamie Love has brought to our attention over and over again, which is that the United States government has issued 59 government use licenses to date. And he just said on a call earlier today that he's got another 140 that he can line up, where the US government in contracting for supplies basically gives freedom to operate and says if there's any patent infringement, it will pay damages, but that the Moderna or Pfizer would not have to. And then last, we kind of let pharma off the hook here because we're talking about government action, and of course, government action is critically important. But the puppet masters, in many respects, with respect to the preservation and advocacy for intellectual property rights and their maintenance, continues to come from industry, an industry that has built, hundreds of billions of dollars of profit on the back of intellectual property regimes. So just if people have thoughts on those questions. So that, unfortunately, 3 questions at the same time, but just to create some space for reactions from the panelists. Esteban.
Yeah, maybe just on one of your points around know-how. I think a couple of points. So in terms of the medicines patent pool, how we've been addressing this. So 2 points in relation to the antiviral licenses that Ellen mentioned earlier. The 3 licenses that we got on antivirals, including the most recent one from Shionogi, provide the possibility of transfer also of know-how. So it's a technical package that can be very helpful for the licensees to speed up development. And that is a possibility for the licensees, so they can take that tech back and therefore benefit from that transfer of know-how. Now, in the context of the hub program, however, to some extent, what we're doing is actually trying to generate our own know-how, within the organizations that are participating in it. But also, I must say, benefiting from support from some organizations that are being very, very helpful, including NIH, for example, that's been supporting the program. in terms of sharing know-how, sharing resources, etc. So there is not something completely isolated from that. There are some of the experts that were involved in generating and developing the underlying mRNA platform technology that are contributing their expertise to the program. So yes, transfer of know-how can be critical, and whatever comes out of the hub will be transferred to all the others so that they can continue to use that. But also at times also having to generate your own know-how when you're not able to get hold of it.
Sankita.
Yeah. So I could just come in. I think the TRIPS waiver proposal, that was perhaps the entry point to have a discussion on what are the mechanisms for technology transfer and know-how. I think the discussions did not get as far because there was a lot of opposition to that, the proposal for a waiver. But you could possibility that, in the WTO, if there was willingness, political will to respond, the nations could have come together to say, okay, we are going to waive Article 39, and these are the mechanisms that we're going to establish for the sharing of technology and know-how, because it is, a global emergency that we have never seen before. So, but the discussion never went that far because the initial reaction was, let's not even talk about it. This is not even an issue, right? You have got the CTAP, it was rejected. There's a COVAX, which has no supply. And everything is well and fine in the world, right? So nobody wanted to discuss this, right? I think there was one idea, and some of this was actually discussed. If companies do not want to share, maybe there could be a sharing of regulatory dossiers with selected manufacturers. But a lot of these discussions did not get very far because of the opposition. I just want to also just come back on, there was a question on, and I said I would answer it live, but I was trying to type an answer, I just pressed the wrong button. But I just want to mention, what is the requirement for compulsory IP knowledge sharing? PHEIC, that we will, how would it work? I think that is the question. So in the WHO discussions, I think we can think about, of course, the TRIPS agreement is in the WTO, and now we are in the WHO. We can talk about having national exemptions in your national law. Again, we can talk about mechanisms for sharing technology and know-how. How do you deal with publicly funded research? How do we share regulatory dossiers not just on a confidential basis, but with selected manufacturers so they can get an insight into it. There is also a discussion on access and benefit sharing. For instance, a lot of the discussion is between what the states do, but the problem we have is how do we put obligations on manufacturers so that they have an obligation to share and do certain actions during a PHEIC or a pandemic. And this is where access and benefit sharing obligations, a framework can actually support, and saying that if you want access to any of this information, the sequence, the pathogens that actually facilitates the development of your vaccine, you have to then give back to the international system. And we have a concrete framework in the context of pandemic influenza preparedness framework. And I think two things to just flag is, we talk about the new instrument, but the new instrument is what pandemic. A lot of the health emergencies are PHEICs. And this is governed by the international health regulations, which is also a legally binding instrument. So it's not sufficient that we just look at the new instrument, because we are in a situation where COVID-19 is a pandemic, but monkeypox, which is an inequity as well, is a PHEIC. So we also have to address these issues in the IHR as well. So there are actually two processes that are happening in WHO, not just one process, just to flag that. Thanks.
How about on the compulsory licensing issue? Does anyone want to talk about that? Ellen, you've written one of the masterpieces on the topic, so maybe you could take it.
Yeah, as we've seen from recent work by Jamie Love, if countries want to use these mechanisms, they can do so, and they can do so on a very large scale. That has, of course, happened with HIV, as we've also documented in our TRIPS flexibilities database, where countries on a very large scale made use of compulsory licensing, particularly of the government use variety, to be able to import antiretroviral medicines, which at the time were mostly available in India, where these products were not patented. Now, that situation is not likely to be repeated in future pandemics, because these newer therapeutics will be more broadly patenting. So that very easy way of compulsory licensing to import products will not really be there. And compulsory licensing can be a very effective tool, but it remains a product by product, patent by patent, country by country measure, which is sort of the opposite of how you want to approach issues in a pandemic, or in a situation where a pandemic is a serious threat. So something that is more automatic and that just kicks in when a particular health threat is there would be much more important. And there was a question in the Q&A, like how will developed countries get on board for any of this. It's also important to recognize that high-income countries are also confronted with the consequences of a situation where a handful of corporations decide where products are supplied and whether products are supplied. If you look at bebtelovimab, that is one of the monoclonal antibodies that is recommended for vulnerable people, for immunosuppressed people with COVID, the company has decided to only make that product available in the United States. It has refused to register it in Europe. It does hold patents in Europe, but it doesn't want to sell it in Europe. And even for compassionate use, it is not available. And these kinds of issues are beginning to lead to a bit of a revolt in the medical profession, that they say, how on earth is this possible that we can't have access to this product while we know this is a recommended treatment. So this is, these cases need to be brought together, and certainly bringing the medical profession into these debates will be very important. Now, the last point on how are we going to progress, we recognize, of course, that that wish list that I showed you earlier will likely not be entirely embraced by everyone. But this is also why the governance and the way the pandemic treaty negotiations advance is so important. I talked briefly about the need for an inclusive governance of this process to allow for sort of taking up these recommendations at various levels, binding in cases of strong consensus, opt-in for harder to agree provisions, and normatively for more novel provisions, so that you get a norm setting effect of the discussion of the pandemic treaty, and possibly also ideas to be taken further. Now, on the technology transfer, it will be important for the WHO delegates to also look at other fora, and Sangeeta also mentioned some of those, because binding obligations of technology transfer exist in other treaties, particularly agreements to do with climate change. I haven't got the details ready in my still COVID affected foghead, but I'll put some links in the chat so people can find our work on this, because that's important. Where has this been done before? And then last, keep in mind, because in fact the WTO TRIPS agreement, which is often seen as the great big evil, has a lot of good language on technology transfer. Technology transfer is the as yet unfulfilled promise of the TRIPS agreement. It's where the bargain has gone wrong. But if you look at the principles and the objectives of the agreement, technology transfer is clearly at the core of that. So to bring that back, sort of these original principles of the TRIPS agreement back into this discussion on tech transfer for pandemic reasons would also be important, I think. Over.
So let's see if our participants are, I think you're able to raise your hands if anyone would like to make a comment or ask a question of our panel. Moga.
Hello, thank you for really useful discussion and the ideas that you put forward and summaries of what's going on and what could be going on. What could go on. Just one comment that I'd like your views about. So what do you think that developing country leaders should do in order to get out of this entanglement, if you like, of like what's happening at the WHO? I know they're trying hard there. What's happening in WHO? We have a chance, but other forums as well. What do they need to do themselves, and how to get them to do it? So, I mean, to give you an example, so we talk about technology transfer, and we do know that the technology exists by large in the North. But how do we get developing countries to prioritize, rich and poor, to prioritize investment in medical research or biomedical research, investment in technology, so that we don't stay as receivers forever? And one of the days we can actually develop the technology, just like what South Africa is doing. I don't know who I'm asking.
Yeah.
Anybody can.
Anyone have a reaction?
Well, I think Fatima already made some points in her presentation. What South Africa could do. It's and you answered part of your question yourself, Moga, by saying countries need to invest in research, but also need to invest in healthcare. But using the mechanisms that are there is very important. Learn from lessons of previous pandemics. It isn't as if countries can't do anything. And I saw it and learn from how other countries are doing. Look at the US, look at certain European countries. My own country, the Netherlands, when Russia refused to share the technical specifications of a license buffer that was necessary to run diagnostic tests for COVID-19. It wasn't a question of a compulsory license, because it wasn't a question of a patent, it was a question of a trade secret. But the minister really went to the company and slammed his fist on the table and forced them, threatening with competition, with the competition authorities looking into this, to collaborate with the hospital pharmacy. So there are a lot of cases like that. There's a lot that happened in Germany that very quickly expanded its ability to make use of compulsory licensing, for example, in the context of the pandemic. So a lot of situations like that may inform the developing countries. And it would also be good for developing countries to raise these issues in the TRIPS Council. What we often see happening is that they are under a barrage of questions from the high-income countries. They have to justify everything, and we see now requests for lists of products where the possible extension of the decision may be applied to, and those kinds of things. Very happened in the past as well. Was always rejected, but the developing countries could ask the high-income countries, so how have you dealt with this? And you get a lot. They will then get a lot of interesting insights, I think, in the measures that are available for everyone. Over.
So I think we have a couple people who've asked questions and would like to speak. Paul Fellner and also Mr. Dodd. Andrew Dodd.
Yeah, I'm sorry, are you asking in that order?
Yes.
Before I jump in. I did get an invitation on the screen too. Thank you very much. Great presentation. I'm really much more encouraged by, although they haven't been completely successful yet, efforts like the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool versus waivers, legal waivers. And the reason is, I think you've got a long hill to climb if you think you're going to use a cudgel to get companies that are protected by the United States intellectual property laws and Western European IP laws to start to disclose trade secrets. And yet we know there's an example of all these companies that disclose lots of trade secret information to get access to the Chinese market. And I'm wondering two things to the prior question, the potential for the so-called global south to collaborate together, both to develop technology, but also to make its markets accessible on the basis of fair dealing. So I asked the question about, for example, there's a condition for approving a dossier that in the United States, the clinical part be made available to generic companies for reference some period of time, 5 years after that approval. That is a mechanism to actually make what would otherwise be trade secret information publicly available. It's not being widely used elsewhere. And I do think we should go further, given the amount of public money that's going into drugs. I want more for my money as an American taxpayer than just a generic reference. I want the CMC. I want to know how to make this stuff. But there's got to be some fairness there. You can't just take away people's R&D, compensate them somehow, maybe make it available on an exclusive basis for a period of time, or reimburse it. And especially in an emergency situation, that reimbursement is a possibility. But providing positive as well as negative incentives. And frankly, the TRIPS waiver is a pure negative incentive. We're going to take your IP. Well, good luck getting my trade secrets. Good luck getting me to tech transfer. We'll be in litigation until the next pandemic before that's going to happen. So I'd just like to suggest or ask, why not look at these more balanced coercive measures instead of just things like IP waivers? And I'll shut up now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for that. And maybe we can take the question from Andrew Dodd too, or the comment, and then the panelists can respond to both our commenters.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the opportunity to ask a question. Can everyone hear me? Well, I just wanted to ask the question, and since we are the discussion sort of based in the Blavatnik, well, I'll ask a question around the Oxford vaccine. There's some discussion here today about mRNA vaccines. And of course, that is sort of one of the main vaccine platforms we saw in the pandemic. And there are several different business models surrounding the vaccines we've seen in the pandemic. And I just wanted to get people's thoughts and maybe a comment on the business model taken with the Oxford vaccine, particularly through perpetual at-cost access to this vaccine in the developing world. And how that sort of fits in with some of the concepts that you're presenting today and some of the sort of thoughts and ideas for the future. And whether how the business model taken with the Oxford vaccine, how that sort of fits in there, and whether people sort of are seeing with, you know, were there issues here with the IP, were there issues in people's thinking that this could have actually been a greater success through different approaches to IP, or not, and how the licensing strategy works with this.
Two great questions. So let's see if we have any responses. Sangeeta, and then Nicole.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, I was a bit triggered by Paul. What I want to say is, the issue has never been that there isn't royalty for these companies. If that was the case, CTAP would have been successful in May. In April, I think it was launched very early in the pandemic. Nobody wanted it. Big Pharma just came out outright, rejected it. They said, no way are we doing any sharing. I think we have to be very clear. And these are all technologies that are publicly funded, right? So the issue was never royalties. And I think the problem we always have is that the issue becomes when we start raising IP, they say, no, you cannot take your rights away. But we are in a global emergency. Every country is at stake. Lockdowns are happening with huge social economic consequences. So in this situation, if you cannot be sharing technology and know-how, then what is the purpose of this technology and know-how really? And I think this is why I think the waiver was put in as a proposal. I mean, the only legal basis in the WTO was the waiver. It was put in, and countries should have come together and say, okay, we have a problem and we should be having mechanisms for sharing technology and know-how. But we never reached that point because the initial reaction was there is no problem, right? But we all know, everybody could see there was a huge problem internationally. So the issue was never that people, manufacturers were not willing to pay royalties because we know CTAP collapsed. We also know, for that matter, the Italian Prime Minister actually approached Moderna for a license. Moderna says, sorry, we don't have enough engineers to send to Italy. Tata in India in December 2020 also approached Moderna. Moderna said, no way am I sharing anything, right? And this was not because they wanted to take the technology away. I'm sure they were willing to pay royalties. So this was never the issue. And I think we are not addressing the key structural, systematic problem that we have with the pharmaceutical industry currently. And I just wanted to flag that point. And I think the fact that even today, and Ellen mentioned that we cannot get companies to share with mRNA Hub voluntarily, shows you, it's a broken system totally, right? So if it cannot work in a global health emergency, we know this is the system that just cannot work unless we do real radical changes to the actual system. So I just wanted to, I think Ellen might be better placed to answer AstraZeneca.
Ellen will come after Nicole.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Okay, yeah, no, thank you very much. The first comment was a bit triggering for me too, because of course it, had been a long time before this waiver discussion really got started into the pandemic. And during that time, companies made enormous profits with that public funding. Many of the companies, charging $40 or $60 a dose. I've gotten my fourth vaccine or something by now. So, there's got to be a limit to how much is reasonable in a pandemic. And at some point, it does seem fair enough to say, okay, you guys have had opportunities to do the tech transfer and share. In fact, it's made it very difficult for even large countries to come out and say that's enough when they're dependent on companies for those vaccines. And a waiver seems absolutely appropriate. But what you want going into this pandemic is a different situation entirely, right? So the proposal that I outlined initially is, to provide funding, sure, for new research and development, but then for that funding to guarantee access on equitable terms for everybody to those technologies. And so that would be, vesting or purchasing the intellectual property, right? Vesting it in an international organization, which could then distribute to manufacturers and scale up production in a way that ensures equity. And so that has been done. It's been done in some cases for things like developed through Drugs for Neglected Disease Initiative and other international organizations. And it's not, it is something we've talked about at the previous webinar, if you're interested. I'll just end by saying, on the AstraZeneca thing, my understanding is that, it was developed on a non-for-profit basis for a while, but once the pandemic is declared over, then they've begun to profit from this by the company. At least I've seen some news to that effect. Others probably have been following this more closely, so I'll let them speak to that. But of course, that's, much better than some business models, but might also leave us with certain questions. Thank you.
And Ellen.
Yeah, just quickly to Paul's point, I don't think anyone is proposing to pursue mechanisms that do not involve remuneration or generous payment for the development of these products. So that's also was my first point in the proposal of going forward. We're not going to get anywhere if there isn't a clear global agreement that there will be generous financing for the research and development necessary to develop pandemic countermeasures. And as others also outlined, the CTAP is also, and as you know, is a royalty-based mechanism. But we're today in a reality where Moderna and Pfizer alone are making 52 billion a year in vaccine sales. So this has become too big to unravel and do something more equitable with. That's the situation that we're in now. But moving forward for the future, we should definitely do it differently. And on that note, we should look at what Oxford and AstraZeneca have done, because I usually make the point that is a more positive example. From day one, this product was indeed developed on a non-for-profit basis. AstraZeneca from day one pledged and actually did that to work with other companies to license the technology to other companies, mainly in developing countries for low cost, high volume production. Therefore, we had high hopes because all of this would have gone so much further if Oxford and AstraZeneca had also agreed to work with the COVID-19 technology access pool, even though it might perhaps not have directly added to what you were already doing, but it would have really changed the, it would have been a huge encouragement and incredibly helpful in trying to get other companies on board for that initiative. And certainly, it was one of the first vaccines that would have really made a difference. But again, I always make the point that that model is one of the better ones, and I think Oxford and AstraZeneca do not always get the credit that they are due in that. Over.
Next, we have Fatima.
Yeah, so just a few things, because I think that the waiver is part of the rules of the TRIPS agreement. This is what all countries agree to negotiating it. This is why people are member states. A waiver is a mechanism that is actually included in the TRIPS agreement. It's their mechanism. It's the mechanism of the global north, which recognizes that one day when you have a public health emergency or a pandemic or an epidemic, then you can temporarily suspend the rules of a global trade body and a global trade regime. But, the opposition that we saw was something that went against the very nature and intent of the TRIPS agreement, which is why many of us have said that the WTO and the TRIPS agreement is not fit for purpose. Because like Sangeeta said, if those rules that have been created by that system cannot work in a pandemic, then what is the point of that system and those rules? And this was, brought to the global world leaders' attention and all the member states in June 2020 already, that the South African government said, instead of every single country in the global south trying to pursue a compulsory license because it's difficult, it's not easy to use, many people have had difficulties, you're threatened with litigation, you put on trade watch lists, it's not an easy mechanism to use unless you're the US government or unless you're the EU. Rather, let's have a waiver which would apply universally and everybody can take advantage of it at the same time. And that is what was resisted. The second thing is that the CEO of Moderna, this is why we say that Moderna, it's very likely that Moderna will try and take legal action against the hub in relation to its work after COVID or beyond its COVID work. It's likened the mRNA hub in South Africa to a fake Louis Vuitton handbag in a media interview. It also said that it doesn't want to send any of its scientists or any of its researchers to the hub. It's a waste of time because they need to be focusing on cancer research. So this is the attitude we have of people who are in positions of power of a vaccine that actually belongs to the American people. And so I think it brings me to the third point about whose R&D. Let us have transparency and disclosure of all R&D of all costs. Let's see whose knowledge and IP this really is before we can even start having conversations about who deserves royalties or what that royalty level should be. And I think that has been the essence of the fight of the People's Vaccine Campaign over the last 18 years, which is why it enrages us even more that Moderna is acting as if it's the exclusive IP holder of all of this knowledge, and it gets to make all of these decisions. And then just lastly on the AstraZeneca thing, we're still fighting for transparency of those contracts and agreements. There are concerns with that model, and yes, there may have been some really early progressive kind of pledges made, but there were different pricing systems. We paid more than for example, another developing country that was disclosed in our parliamentary hearings. We paused that AstraZeneca rollout because of the beta variant. So I think there were also issues that were happening around vaccine selection and the emergence of new variants last year, which had an impact on also Johnson & Johnson, not just AstraZeneca. And the problem with voluntary licenses, or one of the things that the industry argues works in its favor, is that all the power resides with the pharmaceutical industry. And we saw that with the AstraZeneca deals with Serum and its refusal to grant more voluntary licenses to other manufacturers in the global south at a time when it really could have helped. So there was a small window in which had you had more manufacturers making that vaccine, maybe the situation would have been very different. being dependent then on serum, because that's how the voluntary licenses operated, meant that when India, put in place its export ban, that had repercussion not just on COVAX, but it had sort of consequences for other developing countries. So I think the issues around transparency in that particular arrangement, the issues of who's the priority customer in that setup between Serum and AstraZeneca, the issues around pricing, and then the issues around onward sale and donation. That's something that we're still trying to pursue in our courts, whether AstraZeneca actually prevents in the terms of its contracts with countries where it agreed to provide supplies for onward sale or donation. It's something that we're still trying to get to the bottom of. Thanks.
I regret that 91 minutes have passed and we are at the end of our allotted webinar time. I think participants can agree that our panelists have done absolutely tremendous time to share deep knowledge and commitment with us on multiple issues, presenting creative ideas, bold ideas, ideas that if they were operationalized could make a difference in COVID today and access to medicine, particularly for pandemics in the future. And so we will try to keep spaces like this open, but mainly with the hope that the people who are listening feel motivated to connect with panelists, to connect with campaigns in their countries. There's a campaign in virtually every country to try to make some of these ideas become real. And change won't happen unless people push for it. And that's certainly one of the purposes of a webinar like this with the activists that we have on the panel who have been putting oars in the water, as I said, for a very long time. So thanks again to everyone, and thank you to our participants, and thank you to Oxford and Jonathan in particular for hosting us.